My sense is that the United States, in its dominant rendition, really is a culture of death, in which the human spirit is crushed and negated by the pursuit of commodities. And I think the church's vocation is to bear witness against that and an alternative of human life and human community. What artists have to do is to exhibit ways in which the power of life exposes the limit and failure of the dominant ideology of death. And I would think probably in very imaginative ways the cross itself might serve that function if one can impose it on contemporary scenes of dying and killing and suffering and failure to show that these ways of organizing social power finally cannot succeed. It dawned on me yesterday as I was sitting in church, I always thought that that little phrase in Acts 5, we must obey God rather than man, had to do with civil disobedience and marching in the streets and all that. But as I was thinking about talking with you, if you bend that text in an artistic direction, obeying man, meaning human agents, would mean to curb our imagination to the claims of the dominant culture. Obeying God, in that verse, would mean an emancipated imagination that refuses that kind of conformity to co-opted images and metaphors. So what I did is I heard it yesterday. I filtered the verse through the anticipation of our talking about art and artists, who are exactly the people who must not obey man by conforming to dominant images and culture, and they have to do wild, undomesticated images and metaphors to break that open.
Here we have this Way to Calvary, painting by Peter Bruegel, 1564. When I first learned about this painting, I thought of it just as a big, bustling landscape, and it's only in time that as I've looked at it, I've started to sense a great kind of tension and even anxiety in the painting. I mean, we have these dark winds, or these dark clouds blowing in from that distant background coming our way, and you know, we know they're coming our way because this wind, you see it in the cloaks and in hats that are coming off, and here are people with removing their hats and their cloaks are going back this way, so we can see this thing is coming in toward us, you know, this ominous threat. And we have, every now and then, here and there, you see these, like right in here, these women who have their hands to their faces in a kind of state of some grief and anxiety. And of course, everywhere in the painting, or all across the central area, we have the red-coated mercenaries, part of the army of the Duke of Alba, who was sent to subjugate these people, the most well-off and sort of profitable people in Europe at the time, are dominated by this extension of the Habsburg Empire. And yet, throughout the entire scene, there is this feeling of nervousness, you know, about everything that's going on. And you know, you have written about this idea of this wealthy, dominating power that yet promulgates this sort of mentality of paucity or scarcity and anxiety, you know, that I think permeates this scene. And I just wonder what you might say about what generates that sensibility in the face, all this power, and yet at the same time, that anxiousness.
Yes. Well, first of all, it strikes me as, and I'm sure you've seen all of this ahead of me, but it strikes me about how these red-coated guys on horses are everywhere in the scene, so that they are an incredibly dominant force. And it seems to me the counter side of that is that their presence on the horses with their armaments makes everyone vulnerable. So it almost as though they are cringing from them or avoiding them, knowing not to come too close to them. And I suppose that it generates a kind of an ambiguity for the other people, on the one hand, of wanting to avoid that show of force, and on the other hand, of being drawn to it because those people have all the goodies and control all the access to everything. So it leaves people, it seems to me, in a very ambiguous situation. And when they move toward the scene of the execution, I suspect they are totally repelled by it, but on the other hand, they can't stay away from it. And it's the same kind of ambivalence. And I think the work of an artist is exactly to make that ambiguity available to us, which creates the possibility of new decisions.
Yeah, I mean the spectacle, the unfurling of the big banner attracts attention, just as you say. I think.
Right.
The common folk here are represented as caught up, and some are, here's a couple of guys with their bowl of cherries just walking along, and other folks involved with carrying sacks, and some seem to be managing to get away from the pull of this magnet and working their way down, but most, as you say, are being pulled along by it.
Yep.
And they seem to almost exhibit this quality that you've talked about of a kind of numbness. That is something I'd just love to hear you talk about a little bit.
Well, I think the perpetration of violence by the soldiers on horses create a hedge against emotional awareness of what's going on. It operates like a kind of narcotic. So after a while, you don't notice it. Though Bruegel wants us obviously to see it, so the painting itself is a protest against that being narcoticized by imperial power. And I think it's an easy transfer then that we now in our society are narcoticized to imperial power. So we don't blink at the big takeout of the big investment banks. We don't blink at torture. We don't blink at drones. We don't blink at gun violence, because that's all a kind of the message that carried by the red men on horses. And I think that Bruegel's push from beneath is to want to break that numbness and to say that the reality of human life is not carried by the men in red on horses, but the reality of human life is carried by the bodily reality of all these people, and particularly these grieving women. That is an aspect of human reality that the men on the horses can never acknowledge or admit to being present in the world.
When we look at this group of people down here, they really are they're rendered stylistically different from everyone else. When we look at all the ornate folds in the cloth, and the postures, which are quite pageant-like. I mean, they're taking very precise kinds of postures to demonstrate Mary and John and so on, the grief. That contrasts with the sort of naturalism of the dress of everyone else here. And so what we're looking at is a kind of artistry that harkens back 100 years to, say, the art of Roger van der Weyden or Hugo van der Goes, whose style was much more medieval and had this kind of ornate complexity. And so there's almost like a time warp going on here, where this group of people seems to represent a sensibility that is, you know, say 100 years earlier. This is the present reality. And then, of course, the story itself is, you know, another 1,500 years back behind all of that.
Right.
I'm just thinking about that as a prophetic sort of device. Do you find that? I mean, can you think, does right off the bat, can you think of instances where time itself is called to witness in a form, something like this?
Well, would it be the case with these appeal back that these women are people who have not been caught in this ideological drama?
Sure.
And what I think of, I don't know whether it's a very good match, but the preaching of the book of Deuteronomy, which is prophetic, always closes an appeal for obedience by saying, remember that you were slaves in Egypt. So Deuteronomy wants to go behind 7th or 8th century BCE commoditization by saying, that's not the world you belong to. You belong to this other world, and you need to remember that world. And maybe these women are a remembering of a world that does not subscribe to this imperial reality.
The whole of the land itself, the more I look at this picture, it has a sense of being scarred and worn by the forces that are traversing it. I mean, everywhere we look, you know, we're seeing these ruts, you know, and grooves across the landscape, starting from way back here. They build through the center, they build all the way, and then within that we find, like here, I don't know if I'm holding that glass where you can see it, but you see the skull.
Oh yes,
there, bones.
I had not seen it.
Yeah,
right.
And there are bones. Here's a jawbone, right there, and another sort of femur or something.
Yep.
There's a skull right down here at the base, and bones across the whole landscape. And I'm just thinking about the way that Bruegel brings the land itself as a kind of witness, I think, against this.
So that the land has a memory to remind all these people, we have been here before.
Yeah.
We've been here before many times. Yeah.
Yeah.
In Jeremiah 22, Jeremiah has these poetic verses in which he anticipates that the young king Jehoiakim is going to be like a potsherd thrown away. And then right in the middle of it, he has this verse that says, oh, land, land, land. Like the land is supposed to grieve the failure of the power structure. And I hadn't seen these bones and these skulls, but it seems to me that would indeed be a case where the land cries out in its memory of woundedness and death and loss.
Right. There's even a sense, I think, where by the time we get to this side of the painting, what the land is sprouting as growth is these trees of death, all these poles upon which people will die, scaffoldings.
Yep.
And these wheels which have even, you know, residue of previous, you know, bodies and stuff hung on them. Over here we still have some sense of the land producing life, but life and death over here.
So all these emblems of enforcement.
Yeah.
Yep. Wow.
Well, in in the Lech Majewski film, he seems to speculate that up here on this pinnacle, we have the miller who represents perhaps God. And if so, he from his mill is looking down on his son being ground into the bread of life.
Yep, yep.
And if we continue the sort of diagonal across from his sort of lonely, distant grief, you know, to this group of grieving people in the foreground, we have this kind of long line of grief sweeping over
right.
The whole landscape. And you have written about grief as one of the most powerful tools, I think, of prophetic outcry.
Yep. I think that publicly expressed grief, which is what they're doing here, is an act of relinquishment of a world that is lost. And the imperial forces never grieve about anything. They just go from triumph to triumph, to denial to triumph, to denial to triumph, so that underneath, and probably it's important that it's underneath on the painting, underneath is this reality of a grieved world that these people can't acknowledge. And it has struck me only in the last couple months. You know, I've so much thought that the prophets were about divine anger, but it has struck me that the prophets are about divine grief. So Jeremiah 9 has this. He has three scenes of grief. The first one is he says that the pastures are grieving over the drought, and the drought is because of disobedience to the Torah. Then he has a scene in which he says, call for the skilled mourning women, the people that know how to weep over death, because the whole world is dying in front of our eyes. And then the third scene, he personifies death, and he says, death has come up to your window and is looking in and is coming in to get you in your palaces. So it doesn't have to do with divine anger. It has to do with this incredible loss. And I think that artists are the kind of voices of grief that are to protest against this world of denial and triumph and pretense. So this is just amazing. It is as though these women from another world are in touch with that reality that is not permitted in this world.
Well, of course, I mean, the primary conceit or riddle in the painting is the sort of lostness or invisibility of the figure who is at the very center, who is Christ and his cross. And so we have this use of a kind of riddle approach on the artist's part.
Because I think the prophets knew, like all artists, that if you come at it directly, you're simply offering another ideological closure, and they don't want to do that. And I think the main riddling that the prophets do is by image and metaphor. It's never fully clear how the metaphor is functioning, so it requires the work of interpretation to do that.
Well, you know, I mean, we're talking a lot about poetry and artistry. In The Journey to the Common Good, you have this statement where you're talking about the crisis in Jerusalem, in Jeremiah, and you say, if you draw the Old Testament down to its 9/11 crisis of destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BCE, you eventually come to the prophet Jeremiah, who in his poetic daring, had to preside over his 9/11. For it takes a poet to comprehend such profound loss. Imagine, it's not the managers, not the ideologues, not the social activists, not the shrill moralists, right or left, but the poets who are able and compelled to go to the depth of the crisis and reach deep into God's own conflicted heart. Where is the funding for that poetry today? I mean, where do you think we draw upon the resource to fund that kind of imagination for today?
Well, I think there are two sources. One is the great artistic tradition, which in my field has to do with these old texts.
Mm-hmm.
That these old texts always generate other texts.
Mm.
I think that the parables of Jesus, which are subversive, for example, are generated by those old prophetic, poetic images. And so the tradition has a certain generative dynamism to it and expects contemporary poets and artists to pick up this stuff and to reformulate it again. The other source is the arena of human suffering. Human suffering is quite bodily and daily and quotidian. It refuses generalizations, and so it interests me that the great poetry, I think now is maybe a lot, the great poetry comes out of suffering cultures. And that kind of artistry is always subversive. So I think there is a kind of a convergence of the great tradition of subversion in these texts and the contemporary practice of subversion, which says we simply refuse to accept the dominant narrative of reality because the dominant narrative of reality is not true. And I think it's that meeting of contemporary suffering and remembered imagination that are our source.
So we're back, and that it connects us back to grief again and to all of these heavy things that
it does. Yeah. Well, and it's very hard intentional work, because when we don't do hard work and when we don't do intentional work, what we wind up doing is simply reiterating the dominant narrative. That's kind of an easy fallback.
Right.
And thank God for artists and poets that can do it otherwise. Yeah.
Well, that, like what you're saying, like the painting, does not seem, on the surface anyway, let me put it this way. On the surface, we're not seeing a lot of hope. We're seeing a lot of grief, we're seeing a lot of pain, we're seeing a lot of struggle, we're seeing domination. Hope is a very special and delicate thing, isn't it?
It is, yep. But I think that expressed public grief is the matrix of hope. I don't think hope grows anywhere else because grief, which is an act of relinquishment, creates space for new possibility. As long as our lives and our imagination are dominated by what we already have, there's no impetus or possibility for newness. So Paul has this verse in Romans 5, I don't know how it goes exactly, but suffering produces character, and then character produces hope. So if you take the whole thing, suffering produces hope. It's a mystery of the gospel that voiced suffering creates new possibilities. And I think at the beginning of the Exodus narrative, the way that is encapsulated, it says when Pharaoh, redcoats, when Pharaoh died, Israel groaned and cried out. Israel could not groan and cry out as long as Pharaoh controlled everything. And then it says, and that cry came up to the God who made new possibility. So there's a little slippage between the cry and God responding, but it seems to me that's exactly how the gospel over and over narrates it, that the cry of grief in ways that I think we don't understand leads to newness. Yeah. I want to ask you one other thing about the mill. I take it this is the Creator God who grinds out bread, including the body of the Son, but also just bread. And what strikes me about this is that this is so much bigger than this crucifixion scene, that the crucifixion scene is dwarfed.
That is a good point.
By the transcendent life-giving power of the Creator, and usually our art about Good Friday
turns
is
it
focused
around.
here,
Yeah, right.
but it's kind of marginal
yeah, very
to
good
the lives of these
observation.
people.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, that is this distant. It's almost like a speck, isn't it? What's happening out? What's going to happen out there?
That's right. And as you said in the film, the miller is watching, and when I saw that, I wasn't sure I was getting it right, but I thought of Psalm 2, which says, "He who sits in the heavens laughs at the pretense of the nations," and you're never told what the miller is thinking as he looks down on all of this.
Right.
But his capacity to keep producing food for the world is not diminished by this drift, it seems to me. So.
Yeah. I want to come back to this business of the artist, and you have been so great about all of that. You know, I give my students assignments from the prophetic imagination, and I say to them now, wherever Brueggemann uses the word prophet, I want you to use the word artist, and see what happens in your mind. You know, see how it works. And sometimes it goes better than other times, but depending on who I've got in the class, you know what I mean. I always think it goes well, but you know, in this book, in the Finally Comes the Poet, you know, you bring in this wonderful bit of Walt Whitman. And I wonder if I could just get you to read that.
Yeah. I know very little about Walt Whitman, but these lines struck me.
They're so great, yeah.
After the seas are all crossed, as they seem already crossed, after the great captains and engineers have accomplished their work, after the noble inventors, after the scientist, the chemist, the geologist, the ethnologist, finally shall come the poet worthy of that name. The true Son of God shall come singing his songs. I assumed Whitman referred to himself, but he would probably allow for some others too. Yeah. So you obviously can transpose poet into artist more generally about that. The artists, after all the managers, the artists are the only ones who can bear witness faithfully, I think.
You have such confidence then in these artists.
Well, we don't have any alternatives. We have to believe that.
Yeah. Yeah, and once again, we probably have to admit that those same artists will find their way into the camp of the dominating culture as well. and
right.
support and use their skills to create the spectacles of the dominating culture.
The way I like to say that if a good artist will eventually wind up on a late night talk show.
Yeah.
So, don't go.
Yeah,
don't go.
right, don't go. Yeah.